Okay, so I will reiterate what I just said to get us back on track. Polyphony. SynthEdit defaults to 6 voice polyphony. However, you can change this up to a maximum of 128 voices supported by MIDI. However, for polyphony to work correctly, each synthesizer must be in its own container, and each container should have exactly one MIDI to CV module. Note VST plugins control their own polyphony. Alright. We have the minimal. And what polyphony is, in a nutshell, is more than one voice happening at a time. I'm just going to check the level here right quick. I don't want this to be too loud. Okay, I do have a limiter on, so polyphony is generally multiple voices. And it's said that by default, SynthEdit goes up to 6. Now, if I continue to add notes, it's going to take away from the bottom. So we're starting you lose the low end. Actually, it doesn't sound like it. It just sounds like we're losing the last note. So that is called the polyphony steal, which probably will come up later. And I'll continue here along. I just wanted to quickly explain what polyphony is. Needed a second there. Alright. Here. What's on screen? Okay, yeah. All over the place today. How polyphony works in SynthEdit. When a MIDI to CV module is added to a container, all the modules downstream automatically become polyphonic. You can set the maximum number of voices from the container's property dialog. The polyphony is confined to that container. If you bring connections out of the container via an I/O module, the signals merge back into a mono signal. This is one way to control which modules are polyphonic. SynthEdit creates clones of the modules in a container as needed. You can't see the clones; they are generated internally. So we can see a picture here of the MIDI to CV, and it's giving the illustration that when you hit more than one note, it's creating downstream. It's creating more. I keep forgetting that my desktop's showing. And so here we can see these are the voices. This is the debug screen. I got to this by right-clicking any module and more and debug. So we currently have the audio engine running. Now this is the oscillator. This is what's pumping out the sound. And if I'm just actually going to grab this. Turn this off first and grab this keyboard and bring it in here. And yeah, that's not the way I wanted it to look. So let's try like this. No. That's the new view. Here's the old view. So let's put that there. It's just that the new view doesn't have the little T button or whatever it is that makes chords. So open up the debug again, and we'll see you got these little green squares or red squares in the background. I'm mildly colorblind, so you'll have to work with me here. And if we go one, show that. Go one at a time, it's cycling through them. And if we start playing more than one, it starts to fill up those voice spots. Polyphony, the Polyphony Allocation. See, it's starting to drop some as I continue because it's only allocated for 6. So some of these notes there's only 6 notes playing at once here. And this is an important concept for CPU usage, as we want to, say, maximize our CPU usage or have an efficient use of CPU. Of course, we can give the option for controlling how many polyphonic voices there are, or monophonic. However, we are stepping into that. I am just demonstrating the basics for now. We'll follow along with the manual and see what it says next. As well, so when these voices are being created, this is what it's talking about here with cloning. SynthEdit creates clones of modules in a container as needed. You don't see the clones, they are generated internally. So imagine that, as it shows in this picture, we have the MIDI to CV, and then here's the VCA and the ADSR and the yeah. So the VCA and the ADSR. As I'm pushing more notes, it's SynthEdit is creating duplicates of these to follow each voice. So that would be 3 notes playing at once. That also eats up CPU. Well, the CPU would be demonstrated here in the debug menu, and it would represent those extra modules. I imagine. Not 100% sure about that one. SynthEdit only clones the modules it needs to, for example. So we can see there's a MIDI to CV and it's cloning these extra modules. However, there's an LFO controlling, say, the pitch for the oscillator, and it only needs one oscillator. So SynthEdit is efficiently only using one LFO module to oscillate the pitch for 3 different voices. Here the LFO is shared by all the voices. This is because the LFO does not depend on the MIDI to CV module. It is not downstream in the signal path. SynthEdit automatically analyzes each synthesizer signal flow to minimize the number of modules that need to be cloned to sound a new voice. This helps reduce the CPU load and increases performance. That's pretty much just what I said. Note, if you want one LFO per voice, you'll need to connect it downstream from the MIDI to CV module. For example, you could connect the MIDI to CV module's pitch out plug to the LFO via a switch module, then turn off the switch. You would then hear an independent LFO on each note you played. So that would be, that would be, I'm not 100% sure how that would work. However, I'm not demonstrating right now, I am just documenting. SynthEdit saves CPU by monitoring each voice. After a note off, once the sound has died out, SynthEdit suspends all modules in that voice. A suspended module does no processing and uses 0 CPU. SynthEdit monitors the most downstream modules in the voice. There may be more than one. This would typically be a VCA. You can see this in action by opening a module's property window. The small green or red dots in the CPU display indicate the voice activity, 1 dot per voice. Avoid hanging modules. So we have a hanging module here. It looks like a switch. It's coming in and it's not going anywhere. A hanging module is connected downstream from the MIDI to CV, but has no output wires. SynthEdit identifies this as the last module in the voice and monitors its output. However, this module has no output wire, which causes SynthEdit to never sleep the voice. This results in very high CPU usage. So the MIDI to CV is sounding a note, it's going through the oscillator is generating a note, going into the VCA, and it's also coming into this switch box. So that means that the oscillator will never sleep. It's constantly feeding a note to the switch box. If there's no note being played, then it's arguable. I'd have to see whether this oscillator is still going to be able to sleep, because there is something called the Oscillator Algorithm. That's what I call it, where the oscillator will only sleep if it has a MIDI to CV, a VCA, and an ADSR connected surrounding it. This is the only way to get the oscillator to sleep. Sleeping is 0 CPU usage. If there's something like this, like a hanging module intersecting the oscillator algorithm, then this oscillator is never going to sleep. It may run, or how do you say, idle. It may idle at a low state. However, it's still using CPU, and that's CPU inefficiency. So in the end, when I'm creating my synths, I prefer to keep that oscillator algorithm happening as much as possible. The hanging module is connected downstream. Okay, I already covered that. Changing the default polyphony. By default, SynthEdit uses 6-voice polyphony. This can be changed for each synthesizer in a project. Open the Properties dialog of a MIDI CV or a keyboard to right-click Properties to set the desired number of voices in the polyphony parameter. So this is amortized or depreciated. That's not how it's done anymore. There is actually a module for that, which we will look at later. Perhaps that might even have to be part of an in-depth video. Reserve voices. Reserve voices are extra spare voices used only to prevent clicks when you play more notes than the polyphony allows for. 3 to 5 are usually sufficient. Imagine you set a polyphony of 3 and hold 3 notes, then hit a 4th note. What will happen? One of the 3 notes has to stop, but there is no way to stop a note instantly without it clicking. You have 2 options. Have some extra voices in reserve to play the 4th note. This allows the new note to start immediately while one of the other old notes is faded out. This is the best option. Have no reserve notes. SE will fade out one of the 3 notes and play the 4th. This results in latency. Half of your note gets delayed several milliseconds. And the fade out pop is more noticeable because it's not masked by a new note. Reserve notes don't count towards polyphony. Reserve voices are only in effect for a few milliseconds. They only need enough to cope with how many notes you expect to trigger at once, at exactly the same time. I don't tend to trigger more than 3 notes at the same instant, so 3 or 4 reserve voices is enough. This is not related to how many notes you can hold down at once. Polyphony sets that. Mono mode. The MIDI to CV has a parameter mono mode. If set on, actually maybe I should explain this a little bit. The reserve notes. Okay, so reserve notes is, I pretty much explained it in brief here. So that's probably why when I'm playing these 6, it sounds like there's still more than 6. Because eventually this lowest note has to drop out. Okay, there it's gone now. And as I climb, I'm losing more notes. But it doesn't seem like there's any sort of rhyme or reason to which ones are coming out. So they're totally off now, so it must be working from the middle. That's part of the polyphony settings we'll look into soon. But having covered that, that's really what I wanted to highlight for reserve voices. So reserve voices will allow for more than the allocated, polyphony to play. So there's 6. I mean, when I play more than 6, that's 7, I believe. The default is 3 reserve notes, reserve voices. So it is giving me a little bit of wiggle room. However, starting from the middle, I believe, is the note stealing. Mono mode. The MIDI to CV module has a parameter mono mode. If set on, this overrides the polyphony parameter and sets the synthesizer to monophonic operation. Setting the mono mode is useful for bass lines and lead sounds, where you're limiting to 1 note at a time instrument. Fast bass lines sound clearer when several notes blurred together. What? Oh, without. Fast bass lines sound clearer without several notes blurred together. In mono mode, you can use the retrigger option to make legato. Overlapping notes merge together without retriggering the filter. You can also use portamento to slide the pitch between legato notes. So mono mode, yes, mono mode is there. However, the MIDI to CV does not contain this anymore, as this is the MIDI to CV2. Those type of parameters would show up over here. I doubt there's not even a property setting anymore. Again, that's the polyphonic module, polyphonic control module. A common mistake. One common mistake with SynthEdit is to place a MIDI to CV module in its own container. This will lead to the oscillator pitch jumping higher with each new note played. This is because downstream modules, let me get rid of these boxes here. This is because the downstream modules are outside the MIDI to CV module's container, therefore they are not cloned when you play a new note. What happens instead is the two notes' pitches are combined before the oscillator. Another common mistake is to put a reverb in the synth's container, which then gets applied to each voice, eating much CPU, which is usually intended is just one reverb applied to then the merged out option. The reverb is added outside of the container. Alright, so what I believe happens is that instead of cloning the MIDI to CV multiple times, this is what I gather from it, it does clone them multiple times, but the VCA and the ADSR and the VCA, I don't think the ADSR gets cloned. It must get cloned. So yeah, the downstream modules don't get cloned. So say you're pushing like a pitch value of 5 and it's coming out, and then you move up an octave to 6, and then instead of cloning and actually playing them right, to the oscillator is receiving an 11. Not a 5 and then a clone for a 6. So instead it's just that one inside this container, it's coming out as an 11, which is bad because that's, the 11th octave, not 5 and 6, octave 5 and 6. So do not put a MIDI to CV module 2, MIDI to CV, now that it's called 2, MIDI to CV 2, in a container, because that will happen. And it's bad. Alright, what else did I want to cover in regards to that? So that was pretty much a quick brief on Polyphony. We covered, the debug screen, and this debug screen is available for most, if not all, modules. And let's turn on the audio engine. Yeah, so you can see the 6 dots there, and there's the CPU usage bar in the background, percentage. And MIDI to CV, I believe will have that as well. And VCA. So there's all those CPU. So I will quickly pop in the Polyphony Control. And this is a monster. This is actually sort of new to 1.4. I do believe this came out in 1.4. And it does have its short sights as far as the developer made it GUI. So things cannot be shifted live with DSP as far as key triggers, stuff like that. So once a polyphony is set, it's set. That's it. It cannot be changed. Mono mode cannot be changed on the fly as far as like a performance recording with an automation. Yeah. So in order to use this, there is a couple of methods. I haven't looked at subcontrols yet. Perhaps you can look at subcontrols right quickly. So a subcontrol consists, this is generally how I mentioned before, controls come out as, you got the slider, and this is like a DSP control. There's no real way to change this image or this, you can show the readout or not show the readout, you can show the title or not show the title. Show title, no title. And there's this keyboard module here, which can be resized. If I can, stuck. I'm not sure what's going on there. Anyway, yeah, so back to the slider. So show readouts. Oh, now it wants to move. Or show title. So it must be just a bit of a lag, a bit of a glitch. Let's move it out of the way. Yeah, there it goes. Title. And you can change, the type, horizontal control, knob, button toggle, a plain button, or plain button? It's a small button, rather. Plain button. Small knob, small button toggle. What's the difference between plain button and small button? Must be something. And small button toggle, and toggle is just on or off. And whereas a button might be more of a pad, click it and it activates only for that time that it's pressed. And of course, knobs are knobs, and sliders are sliders. So I'm going to quickly outline a subcontrol to control polyphony here. I should actually do a video dedicated just to controls. So quickly just look at polyphony right now in a quick subcontrol. This will be a list type subcontrol. So in subcontrols, this is on the left here, subcontrols, patch memory list, throw that down. And this is important. This is what generally holds presets. And in fact, because you notice that the GUI is on the GUI side, everything's on that side, I don't need this patch memory, as the patch cannot hold the polyphony stuff, I don't believe. There is a way to do so, however, that's more of a intermediate or a little bit more intermediate, which I won't be highlighting now. So in order to control polyphony here, we have a list entry, which I pulled from the subcontrols, and a list entry. I'm going to need a few of them. I'm just going to actually delete them, back out of here, back to the top, and I'm going to hold shift and double click, and we are now in the new view, which is still in demo. I did not want to highlight this before because it is still in demo, and if you're a beginner, then it's just going to mess with you. However, it does give for a cleaner setup here for these list boxes as it's snapping to the grid. I mentioned this before that in the older versions, things didn't snap to the grid. In this case, this list box, and you can see how fluid that is. That's super hard to get to a pixel perfect size type stuff. So I'm just going to back out again and then back into the new view. I'm going to need a few of these. I can actually just copy paste this one because it's already got a reasonable sized white space window. A little bit, make some room, and make some connections. So polyphony, and this is a integer, which is green, and this is GUI as it has a different kind of more teal, more lighter gray background. And this is a text, which is red. That gives me the current Polyphony Allocation, which is default 6. So now Polyphony Reserve, which again is a integer, it's green, and an item list. Item list, like so. So yeah, I had guessed right before when I said the Polyphony Reserve was set to 3 by default. Now these other ones, voice stealing, mono mode, and stuff like that, are something a bit more intermediate. However, this is good enough for now. I just wanted to show off the Polyphony Control, where it was, and how to connect to it. Voice stealing, mono mode, mono retrigger, these are things that will likely be covered in the manual. So, actually they have been, mono mode has been. So we'll look at that right quick. In order to do a conversion here, I have to demonstrate how to turn a list into, how to demonstrate, what's coming out of this text area here. So I'm going to bring in a text entry. And what this is doing, what this box, this Polyphony Control is sending, is it's sending, the integer. So the integer is coming in here and selecting, 0 or 1 to 128, I believe. Max, can I scroll? No. Ancient clicks. Ancient clicks. Gotta wait and click and hold. So yeah, 1 to 128. And allocating 128 would be pretty resource heavy. I could just do like say 24 for now. Well, actually, let's stay on task here. I was going to show you how to convert and get to mono mode. So we'll go back to 6, and we'll leave poly reserve there, and mono mode. So I need to, out of the polyphony green or integer is the selection between 1 to 128. Now out of the red is just a list relating to the polyphony. It tells this box that, okay, you have a choice between all of these. And we can see all the choices by connecting a text. See, it says range 1 to 128. And there's no way to change this. Like, I can't program this box to something else, like, 256. If I put 256 there, it's just not going to listen. I mean, it may change up here. Actually, let's go 0. Oops. Just so I don't have to scroll forever. And it may change up here or whatever, but there's just no such thing as 0. Is there? I guess there is. I stand corrected. Right. So I guess you can change the stuff down there, but I highly do not recommend. I recommend against it. So likely lead into a VST crash or even SynthEdit itself crashing. So, but yeah, I just wanted to demonstrate that's what's coming out of here. And as well, it can be, say, it says range. This is a, how you say, a function of item lists is range, and then you put the first number, comma, the second number. However, most times when you're programming a list, you separate values by commas. So go 1 and not dot, comma, 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And then what comes out of here is just that. So you can also limit, limit the end user to just those 6 options. See, I'm trying to do a documentation, but I keep telling people what they can do. And it should only be about what SynthEdit does. I'm taking the second person, third person. So yeah, I can limit people to just those 6. As well, I could say, like 60, 600, So I do believe that 600 would actually come out as 6. It would still be 6. I mean, that doesn't matter what value I put there. I could type it, 6. And it would still be 6. Or I could say 50. And even though it says 50, it would still be 6. It's because the item list, it's programming what it's saying. And I do believe if I remove this programming, it should revert right back to its normal list. And then I plug this in again, it'll give me range. That's why I say it's not good to program this, because it's always gonna override whatever you program. That is, however, not the same for something like a patch memory list. Whatever you program into a patch memory list, that's what it's going to be. So hopefully that made sense. And now that we understand what item list and choice is and how it's being programmed, we can take this mono mode here. And what does mono mode say? Well, I can't connect to it because it's black. It's a Boolean, or Boolean. However, Boolean? A lot of people say it differently. I'll just say Boolean. Boolean. I'm going to go look that up. I need my stream helpers back, just so I don't sound like a complete numbskull here. And what am I doing? That's right, I'm going to BRB. Microphone check. Okay, so the microphone is still active during a BRB. And I am going to look at a pronunciation for Boolean. However, I won't be able to won't be able to stream it because it will be copyright protected. So I'm going to kill audio somehow. Boolean. The black is Boolean patch type connect, which is a true or a false. And in order to program this, we need a list entry. This is a little more of an intermediate segment, and we'll go conversion under subcontrols. Conversion, it has to be subcontrols, so it's GUI, and we will go Boolean to integer. I imagine there's other ways to do this with a single button or other display elements. However, for the sake of simplicity, this is how it's going to happen here. Now, as I mentioned before, the text box can program the list entry item list. However, we see we have no item list, but we do have a item list on our list entry on this side. And in order to access that, we can come from here. So item list would be on or off, on or off. And that's it. That's all there is to it. So it will switch between mono mode or polyphonic mode just by clicking the list box. We can demonstrate this. I have to back out of here and then back into the old view because I need that T to demonstrate polyphony. So it is still in polyphonic mode even though it says on. So I have these in reverse here. It's off first and on second. And again. Okay, so it's not working at all. Nice. What's wrong with it? I mean, if I set the polyphony to 1, that'll work, right? Yeah, so that's an alternate monophonic mode. However, this should work. Integer the bool, is it 3 perhaps? So let's do some diagnosis here. Bool to integer, which I already have, and then let's check text entry. And we'll go bool to text. I'm not sure if that's going to display anything. Yes, 0 and 1. See, it should work. So mono mode on. Okay, so now it works. Not sure what happened there. So it is off and on. To demonstrate. So that's on, and here's off. I'm not sure what happens if you do them at the same time. No. And off, and on. No. Doesn't do much of anything. Maybe because perhaps now this is visible. No, that's not the case. And on. Okay. And off. Alright, so it works. So that's how to get into mono mode, opposed to how the manual says that it's part of the MIDI to CV, which is not true. It was once part of the old MIDI to CV, which is in the old and MIDI to CV. As we can see here, this is what it's talking about. Mono mode is there. And as we also see, this is a DSP, which can respond live to automation, where now for the MIDI to CV2, the Polyphonic Controls are now part of the GUI segment, so GUI section, and cannot be controlled with automation, which is unfortunate for things like auto glide or portamento rates, just changing between, say, mono mode, turning it on and off. I mean, it's not that big of a deal. For things like portamento time, it kind of is. But for the most part, it isn't. Looking at the rest of polyphonic controls, we haven't covered anything else here besides mono mode. So jumping back to the manual, just to double check that. So mono mode and common mistake. So yeah, the common mistake there mentioned is putting the MIDI to CV in its own container, like so. So we have, you have your MIDI in from the MIDI out outside, and you're putting it here, and then hopping in here, and you're putting your MIDI to CV in here, and bringing in an I/O module, sending your trigger through gate and pitch. Now what happens if we get rid of this MIDI to CV? Nope. That's just the oscillator running manually, because it'll always run. This is what I was talking about before. Yeah, it's always running if there is not the oscillator algorithm, and it should still be running. Yeah, until I close it with pitch. Hide that. Not specifically close it with pitch. I need this debug screen back here. And once this connection is made, it should. No, because this is in a container. So yeah, that's another thing. It never sleeps. This would be similar to also a hanging module. So now we have one note, works fine. Let's add another one. Yeah, see, it's adding them together. Now if we go right click and more and uncontainerize, we pop it out and we're back to normal, because now it's cloning the downstream modules properly instead of accumulating or adding together all of the internally cloned MIDI to CVs. So I hope that makes sense, and I'll pretty much call the brief of Polyphony there. I mean, if there's any questions, throw them in the comment section, definitely. It's a big one. However, I would like to mention at this time, I will be doing an in-depth Polyphony looking at refining the SynthEdit system more, just for efficiency, looking at paraphonic, what have you. So I'll probably do that today. This was a big section. However, the in-depth video will be on my Patreon. That's the way it's gonna go for that. So anyone who's really committed to building that advanced synth, check it out there. Someone who's just starting out, I recommend sticking with the basic stuff, and I will be continuing to bring basic stuff, and I'll call that the end of this for the brief. So definitely check out the Patreon for the intermediate stuff. I will also be adding expert stuff as far as I can take it. I mean, I'm sure there's much more advanced stuff that can happen in SynthEdit. However, I only know so much. And yeah, I'll call it there. So until next time, I will be back today. I just need a bit of a break. Like I said, I got landslided right before I jumped on stream. So I apologize for the inconsistencies and the terribly informal stream, but that's how my streams are generally going to be. Likely is just really winging it. So yeah, until next time.